Hi guys, today I'm going to share with you paper piecing for the Ghost Party sew along. So these are the templates for the stars and we're going to start with those. I did already cut some out. I have my pile of fabric. This is what I'm using for the stars. And I'm just going to grab a fabric here. I think I'm going to start with a green or maybe a purple. I want a little bit of contrast in my first one. So we're gonna do that. So I already cut out the templates very loosely, so there's nothing too special. I don't cut them out on the line because I'm trimming them down. I do use typically a different rotary for those, but if you don't have that, that's fine. So typically what I'm gonna do is just cut chunks from my fabric to fit a little bit bigger than the piece I am sewing. So if you're doing solid stars, you don't have to sew the lines on this first middle piece. You can just cut a large one piece for it. And I'm actually going to do with a basting stitch. So a basting stitch on your machine is like a 4 or 5. I'm just gonna baste along one of those lines, the outer lines, to hold it in place. Can you see that? To hold it in place while it is being trimmed down. And usually upon trimming, that basting stitch will be cut away. If not, I can just pull it out. So that's my piece for the middle. My next is this piece. So you can see that the larger piece of this is the one that you want to start with. This is not meant to be a foundation paper piece tutorial if you've never done it before. This is just kind of showing you how I do it and what works for me. So you start with the number 1 piece. That's the first piece you're going to cut and just have on your paper. And remember, after you piece it, your fabric is going to be on the back of your pattern piece, and it's going to be facing up. So I just keep that in mind sometimes. As I'm cutting just kind of under here, and a similar shape to my piece. And then I'm going to cut a little piece of my star fabric just to stitch and flip on there. Stitch and flip is a term when you are stitching, and I'm just gonna iron the crease out of this. I have my ironing board over here off screen to the left, and I just have a little piece. Now you could have cut this smaller, but you know, for sake of not killing ourselves, bigger is always better with FPP. So I just kind of take this seam line that I'm gonna sew along, and you can fold it so you can kind of see where that seam is on the front and kind of align your fabric a 1/4 inch over that seam into the space. So your fabric should be, it's a little hard because it's a solid, but this should be the right side of your fabric and the right side of your fabric facing each other. And the fabric should be, your star piece that's going to end up being here should be away from there. Like your seam allowance should be in the space. So it's kind of backwards. Now I'm going to put my stitch length back to 1.5, 1.8. And I'm going to sew right on that line, and I'm going to go across my seam allowances because I want to have that go all the way across so that I don't have any issues when I'm piecing it. I'm gonna pull back my piece, and I'm gonna trim this down to a 1/4 inch. It's pretty darn close, and I know a lot of people like to trim prior to sewing. So they trim the purple and then they align the yellow up to the purple edge. So you can see that's my seam allowance, and then when I open this up, and I'm just gonna finger press here, but it's gonna cover the area that the star is. It takes a little bit of time to get used to these. This is the best piece in the stars to play with. So I'm gonna iron this flat and then I'm gonna trim it up, but I sew all my pieces together and just kind of put them in a pile and then trim them up. A great piece to start with are these. This is you can paper piece a half square triangle. You don't have to, of course, you can just make one. And there's not many in the pattern, but you can paper piece it. That's a great way to try a fabric because you can literally cut 2 triangles of fabric out and use those to paper piece. This is another great one to try, basically by cutting a square and then you're gonna stitch and flip that little corner. Those are really basic FPP, and again, this is very similar. These all can be traditionally pieced as well, and that is shown in the pattern. But if you're FPPing and you're new to it, those are great pieces to try out. The eyes are a little bit more intense because you have the eye piece and then you're adding these little squares and then you are adding this big piece, and the mouth is similar. Adding the little squares and then this piece and this piece. You always go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and up. So I'm just gonna kind of continue here onto my next piece. The one is this larger piece, and again, that is my background fabric. So I'm just cutting a piece out of my background fabric, a little bit bigger than what I'm sewing because it'll trim it down. And you can see it covers that whole section and it reaches a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch over into past where the seam will be. We're gonna cut another little piece for our star. So how I would paper piece these is I would take how many background fabrics you have and divide that by the amount of stars you have for the whole pattern, and then make that number out of each background fabric and then evenly distribute those through the quilt. Each block, each ghost has 3 stars with it, I believe. Jack, who is this short little fellow, he has 4, it looks like. I'm looking over at my ghost party quilt right now, it's hanging up. So you will have to print more of those FPP section pages. So then, to cut my next piece, this is my seam that I'm gonna be seaming. You can actually fold it back and then I can see that I could do about 1/4 inch seam allowance. You just wanna make sure you don't ever cut it. Or you can just kind of lay it over and cut a piece. And then again, we're gonna do the same thing on that seam, so you can see, it's hard to see on the purple, probably very hard in the video. I can see my crease. So if I'm holding this fabric here, I know I need to fold that under for my seam allowance. So you can fold it under, and this is a great way if you have like an angled piece to kind of make sure the piece covers your pattern, and then flip it over and sew. Don't forget to sew across those seam allowances. Again, I'm gonna trim this off down to about 1/4 of an inch. If you are methodical and have time and want to do it, you can use an add 1/4 ruler or rotary cut that. If you have like a little cutting mat, you can just do it right next to. I don't do that. That's just kind of too much work for me, I would say. Okay, last little piece. I'm going to cut a little piece out here. The trick with FPP is pretty much always remembering, so this is a tiny piece, but I'm gonna use it because it will fit over my piece. So for this one, I'm gonna cut that down to 1/4 of an inch first, so I can kind of align it a little bit better. I mean, it's roughly 1/4 inch, so that then I know I can align that with my 1/4 inch and it'll be pretty close since it's a pretty small piece. What was I saying? I was saying something about making, the trickiest thing is that it's in reverse. And so sometimes that is really hard to figure out if your pieces are very oddly shaped, which happens a lot in FPP. Again, I'm gonna fold on that seam line, kind of finger press it so I kind of know where to align it. And then I'm gonna line it up. So I'm gonna have about a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, there's that. Now I will trim this down. The less bulk you have in your seams, the better, because that is not as comfortable on a quilt. Now we're gonna trim all these little pieces up and sew them together. Okay, I put my cutting mat down here because I did not want to move my camera. So the biggest help with this is having a ruler that fits the block size, because then you can just, sorry, the light on this is making that glare. Then you can just use it and align it on the 1/4 inch seam. So even though it has the seam lines and the seam allowance line, ooh, you have to be careful not to let it shift while you're cutting. I always make sure to align my 1/4 inch mark. Let's see if I can get this up. So you align the 1/4 inch on your seam line, because that ensures that you do actually have a 1/4 inch of a seam. Does that make sense? Instead of just cutting along that black line, I align my 1/4 inch line on that line, and then my cut is going to be exactly. The only trick with a smaller ruler is sometimes it won't do those angled pieces. That one seemed to work out okay. There, you don't necessarily have to cut those little lines off at the edge, at the corners. You can. I don't think it's super necessary. I will show you my tip for aligning, just so that you know how to do it. So yeah, it goes pretty quick. If I'm just kind of in the zone and making these little dudes, I could probably finish a star in not too long. So I've got a little bit of a glare on these rulers from the light above, but it makes the space so much brighter when I'm filming that I like to turn it on. Let's see if I can remember how this goes. It's been a little bit of time since I have made one of these stars. A good 3 or 4 weeks. I do maybe have these stars in a Christmas pattern I'm working on. So it's a good time to get good at them because they're super fun. They add the cutest little sparkle to these quilts. Okay, there's our little star. So I'm gonna go back and get it set up to sew again, and we're gonna do that. Okay, I brought out another great tool that I like to use for paper piecing. It's a seam roller, and let's put this little star together. Now in the pattern, it does have a section on which of the pattern pieces to sew together to make the star. So you're gonna sew A to B, so it aligns like this. You're of course gonna sew right side together. And the trick is, for good alignment, I like to have a pencil handy, and I don't do this on the pattern because it would take so much time, is this little line that's your seam line, to extend it all the way up to the edges. And after a while, you will get used to this and you will just be able to eyeball it. And then what you want to do is align that piece so that it hits right at where the piece underneath starts. And here it doesn't go to the end because our paper doesn't go to the end. But once you open that up, it will align. Make sure to keep that small seam allowance. You can see here how I did that. And then I'm just gonna open this up. And it's a pretty good alignment. This line continues up and this line continues up. You can peel off the paper. What I love about this pattern is I can kind of pull the papers out as I sew the pieces together. So the next one you can kind of see here that goes is these two go together because you want to make that complete line to sew to this one. So I'm gonna sew on this side, you can see I just flipped it over. And because I'm sewing on this piece that has the seam allowance line to sew on, I'm actually just gonna remove the paper over here. You can kind of bend these if you need to perforate that paper a little bit more, but usually you can just peel it off pretty quickly. So that way, as you're sewing these pieces together, when you get to the end, you literally only have these pieces left and you don't have like lots of little pieces stuck in seams and stuff. So I really like to do this. Again, if you want to, if you're not used to eyeballing things, extend that line up to the seam allowance. Pull it back, and here we have it. Pretty good. You can use the seam roller just like this. It is a way to press those seams flatter without using an iron, because sometimes you have a lot of little seams to do and it's not advantageous to use your iron, or your iron doesn't work well with paper. So I took all those pieces out again, and we have our last one to sew up. So I'm gonna flip this over for some reason. It makes more sense to me, having the point at the bottom, and then flip it over, align it so that about our 1/4 inch, I'm gonna have to scoot it up just a touch, and sew it together. And there we go. So I'm just kind of gonna fold that over to help me perforate those pieces a little bit better. I guess not perforate. Just loosen them, I guess. And we have a star. So if you are having trouble getting these to be your exact size square, you could not trim these outer edges, just trim the inside edges and then around that. And then that way, when you sew these together, your edges will be a little bit bigger, and then you can trim it down to your square after. So that's a good way to do that. I'm gonna share how to do the eyes and the mouth as well. I thought I would piece the FPP Ghost Party eye a little bit closer up so you could see it a little bit better. So I kind of cut out pieces similar to the size, but definitely larger. When you're piecing FPP, you have to keep in mind your seam allowances. And as you can see, and maybe even see the dark line, it does go a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch over and goes over the line here. I also want to remind you that you piece in reverse. So this is when I already pieced, but when I flip it over, it's the opposite of what it looked like. Doesn't really matter with the ghost party eyes because they are pretty reversible unless you use directional fabric and that bugs you, but can be an issue for other things if this is your first time FPP. So I just follow the numbers on my pattern or any FPP pattern, and you start with 1, and that's your first fabric to go down. And remember, you're putting it on the opposite side, so this is the wrong way. This is the back of the fabric. You want to be fabric facing up on the back of the fabric. And next I'm going to do number 2. So I've kind of chopped up some pieces to fit. I would recommend using slightly larger pieces if it's your first time. So this, you want to do right sides together on the back, but I'm just kind of laying it out. So when you're sewing, you're actually going to sew it, put the bigger part of the piece on this side with your fabric overlapping that seam line, and because this is your seam allowance over on this side. So once it's sewn, it would be folded over and cover that section on the paper piece pattern. But I have to do that on the opposite side. So like we've talked about, again, I'm re-videoing this because I didn't track the first time. So I thought I would do a little bit closer up. And so I like to finger press to get that kind of registration line. And I know that my fabric needs to end up here, but in order to get it there, I have to sew it on this side, making sure that my fabric overlaps that finger pressed line about 1/4 inch for my seam allowance. I'm gonna hold it into place. Some people might use pins if they're not used to it. I'm gonna get it situated underneath, and I'm gonna sew. Remember, we're sewing with 1.5 to 1.8, and I'm sewing through my seam allowance. So that registration mark that creased my paper as well kind of helps guide where my needle will go. And then I have this piece here. So before I trim, some people do trim before they sew. I like to press it open, and a seam roller can come in handy at this point if you don't have an iron handy. I just like to press it open to make sure it will cover that whole section. And it looks like it will, so I'm gonna trim off this bit. Remember, dark fabric shows through light fabric. So for the eyes, you definitely wanna trim all of that dark fabric off. And you wanna trim about 1/4 inch. You can do this with a ruler and a rotary cutter by pulling the paper back and laying it down on a cutting mat and lining your ruler up 1/4 inch past the seam and rotary cutting it. You just don't want to cut your fabric. So I have my first point. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect because after we sew this whole block together, we're going to cut out the block itself and it will make a very lovely, perfectly pieced item. So I'm just going to go to the next corner. On the pattern, it shows 3 here. And I'm gonna do that same fold over to kind of give me that registration mark to know where I'm supposed to be. Make sure my fabric is right sides together, and I have a little bit of a seam allowance so that I can sew across there. And this would be where, if I'm doing a rotary cutter, I can pull that paper back. See how I folded it down? Put a ruler right along this edge and 1/4 inch over, and then I can use a rotary cutter and trim right along there. So that is a great way to do it with a rotary cutter. A lot of people like those very precise. I try and have my fabric be over about 1/4 inch. And I actually realized when I started sewing again that you could see that ring reflection of the light. So I just put this fabric here to deflect that. So we're going back to doing a little fold over to get that line, making sure my fabric is right side down, roughly 1/4 inch over that line. and doing a seam and trim. And then a press. You can just finger press it. Last one, you will do the same process for the mouth, which I do show in this video, and any FPP really. It just takes a little bit of time. So this is where I would probably go and iron it just to get these points down if you don't have a seam roller, because the next step is sewing on this larger piece. So we have our eye and the 4 corners, so we need to sew this piece on. So I'm gonna repeat the same process of folding to get that little registration mark. You can hopefully see it there. And then we want this to end up here, which means that we have to have the seam tucked under, which means that we need to put it right side together to sew it. I am not a teacher, so I do not mean this video to be a tutorial, more of just like a how I do it. I would say it would definitely be beneficial to watch some tutorial videos, but it is always really helpful to see a video of what you're actually piecing instead of watching a video where they're making something else, which is why I wanted to make these. So here I have my black fully pieced because I have all my pieces together. So I'm gonna trim it now. Okay, I have this tiny little rotating cutting mat, which works perfectly to sit on my sewing machine. And rotating sewing cutting mats are awesome for HSTs specifically. So this is a great pattern if you have something like this to grab the actual square size ruler and you can just zoop, cut it out. I have a regular ruler, trying not to get that reflection. I also have a black lock, which works just as well. You just want to make sure whatever ruler you're using is the same size, really. Sometimes there's a slight difference, and you can also use a big ruler, totally fine. We're gonna get a little bit of that glare, so I'm gonna try and angle it down for us. What I like to do with any FPP pattern is, in theory, you can just cut on the cut line, which is this lighter line on the outer edge. This darker line on the inner edge is the seam line. I prefer to line my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler on top of the seam line, and I usually cut 2 sides at once and cut. And then I have a perfect 1/4 inch seam, because once in a while you can print these a little bit off, or it doesn't quite work out to exactly a 1/4 inch depending on your sewing machine. So again, I am just aligning my 1/4 inch mark line on either side directly on top of that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am cutting it right there. And there you have it. We have a ghost party eye and another ghost party eye. They don't really sit like this. Anna is like this, and I believe Jack is like this, and Boone is like this. So you can see they are opposite of what they show on the back. And so you just flip them. And like, this is great because you can print 2 of the same direction, but you can just flip this over and use it upside down. It's totally fine. Do this last piece that is our mouthpiece today. I feel like this gives you a good overview, and I don't really need to do the HST or the point pieces because those are literally just 2 pieces. So I think you'll be okay with those if you haven't paper pieced before. And I really recommend traditionally piecing those because they're so simple. So I already cut out a few little pieces to use today, so I'm going to do that. Just making sure to cut it the correct way. Which I did that wrong. Hold on, I can use it for that one. Okay, so we're gonna come over here. And I just shifted it a tiny bit. We just want to make sure we have about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that has the strongest seam. Like I was saying before, I go through the seam allowance for my stitch, and then I either end at the next seam or I go 1 stitch past. You don't want to really go much farther than 1 stitch past because it can hinder when you're cutting that seam allowance on a different side. Then our other one, which I'm going to cut this guy. And then this guy doesn't have a seam allowance on either side, so I try to end as close as possible. Open that up and do that. And a good way, if you need to make sure that it covers your whole piece, is like hold it up to a piece of light, like, and then you can kind of see the shadow. This is my next piece. I'm going to align it for this piece up here. And then the only other tip I would say is, because lighter fabric, you can see darker fabric through it on seam allowances. Make sure you do trim down any dark fabric so it's fully behind the light fabric for that seam allowance, because otherwise you might see it a little bit and it won't be awesome to see that shadow on your fabric. Okay, just cutting out this last little piece. I'm laying it over. Just gonna take a gentle peek to see where my seam will go, and I think we'll be fine. I can even use a little less fabric and stitch it up. Okay, I just trimmed them down. We have our eye and our mouth, and remember, they are not seamed in, so once they're seamed in, they'll have those perfect proportions. And this, remember, the mouth is only half of the mouth. You'll have the other half of the mouth, so it'll be centered. And these you can traditionally piece as well.